They called me dead weight in front of 40 shareholders, and nobody in that boardroom made a sound. "Get the old machinist out of my boardroom," Preston Bishop said, tapping his pen against the table like a metronome counting down my dismissal. "He's dead weight, and this company doesn't carry dead weight anymore." The air conditioning kept humming. Somebody's ice cube shifted in a water glass 3 seats down. Nobody coughed. Nobody looked at me. My own wife stared at a spot on the table like it held the answer to a question she couldn't bring herself to ask out loud. I stood there, 64 years old, feeling like an heirloom clock. Somebody finally decided didn't match the new furniture, carried out to the curb without a second thought, still ticking, still keeping perfect time, just no longer wanted in the house. Before we go further, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what time it is right where you're sitting. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and for 31 years I built precision components for a company that used to carry my name on the door. In 1998, I borrowed $40,000 from my father-in-law to buy my first CNC lathe. I worked 80-hour weeks for 2 years without taking a paycheck, so the first production run would ship on time. In 2003, when the original founding partner walked away and left the company bleeding cash, it was my design, a titanium valve seal nobody else in the industry could manufacture within tolerance, that kept the doors open. I never once asked for more than what was fair. That patience is exactly what let them believe I'd stay quiet forever. The company was called Whitfield Bishop Precision back then. By the time Preston finished his sentence in that boardroom, the sign out front had read Bishop Aerospace Components for 6 years, and nobody had bothered mentioning that to me directly. I'd noticed the new letterhead in a shipment of quarterly reports and said nothing. That was the kind of man I'd become inside those walls, the kind who noticed everything and said nothing, because saying something had a way of turning into another argument I couldn't win against Walter Bishop's money and Preston Bishop's noise. Elaine and I had been married 36 years. Her father, Walter, built a fortune in commercial real estate before I ever met her, the kind of fortune that buys silence at Thanksgiving and control at every company he touches. When I needed capital to turn a good design into an actual manufacturing operation, Walter's $40,000 came with strings I didn't fully understand until they'd wrapped around my throat 1 decade at a time. Preston, Elaine's younger brother, joined as Chief Operating Officer in 2011, with an MBA and absolutely no patience for a man who still preferred the shop floor to the boardroom. He called me the machinist, the way other men call somebody the help. At first, it stung. Then it just became true, at least in the way everyone around that table had come to see me. I need to tell you something about myself before this story goes any further, because I'm not going to pretend I was some flawless patient saint who absorbed every insult without a scratch. 2 months before that boardroom meeting, Elaine's cousin hosted a 50th anniversary party for her parents, a big tented affair with a band and 100 guests. I stood near the parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself walk through that tent entrance. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not nerves exactly, something older than that. My own father had lost his hardware store in 1979 in front of half our town, auctioned off piece by piece, while neighbors picked through his tools like vultures at a carcass, and some part of me that I never talk about associates any room full of well-dressed people staring in my direction with that same slow-motion humiliation. I made it inside that tent eventually. Elaine found me a chair near the back and never asked why I needed it. I never told her the real reason either. That's its own kind of quiet weakness, and I'm not proud of it. Here's what nobody in that boardroom knew. Here's what Preston, for all his MBA vocabulary, never once thought to check. When I signed the original licensing agreement back in 2003, keeping the company solvent required more than my design work. It required the patent itself, filed and registered under my own name, Daniel R. Whitfield, not under the company. Walter's attorney at the time drafted a licensing agreement granting Bishop-controlled manufacturing exclusive rights to produce my valve seal design in exchange for a token royalty, contingent on one condition buried in paragraph 14, that I remain the company's founding chief design officer in good standing. Nobody ever imagined I'd be removed. Nobody ever thought to renegotiate that clause once the company started printing money on the back of a part only I had ever designed and only I still legally owned. I didn't know it yet, but that overlooked paragraph was about to become the most important 4 sentences either family had ever read. After Preston's declaration in the boardroom, the meeting continued around me like I'd already left the room. Someone moved to a vote on quarterly projections. Someone else asked about a supplier contract in Ohio. I sat back down because nobody had actually told me to leave yet, and some old stubborn part of me refused to give Preston the satisfaction of watching me walk out mid-sentence. Elaine sat 2 chairs away, close enough that I could see her knuckles whiten around her pen, far enough that it might as well have been the length of a football field. When the meeting finally ended, she caught up with me in the parking garage. "Daniel, wait." Her voice cracked on my name. Preston shouldn't have said it like that. But he should have said it, I said. I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at my own reflection in the window of my truck. An old man in a company polo he no longer had any right to wear. That's the part you're not correcting. She didn't answer that. Her silence answered it for her. I want to be fair to her, even now, even knowing everything that happened after. Elaine spent 36 years married to a man who chose the shop floor over the golf course, who came home smelling like cutting oil instead of cologne, who never once resented her family's money, even while it slowly swallowed everything I'd built with my own hands. But she also spent 36 years as Walter Bishop's daughter and Preston Bishop's sister, raised in a house where loyalty flowed in one direction only, downward from the patriarch, and she had never once in our marriage found the spine to point that loyalty sideways, toward me, when it actually mattered. That night, over a dinner neither of us finished, I asked her directly, "Did you know they were going to do that today?" She set down her fork. "Preston mentioned restructuring the design department last week. I didn't know he meant you specifically, not like that, not in front of everyone. But you weren't surprised." The silence stretched long enough that our son Ryan, 31 years old and 2 years into his own position as a project manager at the company, looked up from his phone at the head of the table like he'd walked into a room mid-explosion. "What happened?" Ryan asked. "Ask your uncle," I said, and left the table. Ryan didn't ask his uncle. Ryan didn't ask me either, not for 3 more days. He worked directly under Preston, learning operations, building the kind of career capital a young man builds when he keeps his head down and his opinions to himself. I understood the impulse even as it hollowed something out in me. My own son, watching his father get gutted in a boardroom, chose the safer silence. It's the same silence I'd been practicing myself for 2 decades, so I couldn't exactly stand in judgment of him, but it stung in a place different from anything Preston had said. I spent that weekend in my workshop at home, the small detached garage, where I still kept a bench lathe and a wall of hand tools older than Ryan. I wasn't building anything. I was thinking, turning a scrap of titanium over and over in my palm the way I used to when I was designing the original valve seal geometry 23 years earlier. Somewhere in that turning, an old memory surfaced, a filing cabinet in the back corner of my workshop, a fireproof lockbox I hadn't opened in years, containing the original patent applications and every licensing document I'd signed with Walter's lawyer, back when the company was still small enough to fit inside a rented warehouse. I found the lockbox behind a stack of paint cans, dusty, the little brass key still taped to the bottom where I'd left it in 2004. Inside sat a leather-bound engineering notebook, the pages soft with age, filled with my own handwriting and pencil sketches from the earliest days, cross-sections of the valve seal, tolerance calculations, notes scrawled in margins about heat treatment temperatures. Behind the notebook sat a manila folder, the original 2003 licensing agreement, my signature and Walter's attorney's signature, both faded but legible. I sat on an overturned bucket in that garage and read paragraph 14 3 times before I let myself believe what it actually said. I didn't know it yet, but I was holding the only piece of paper in the world that still made me more powerful than every bishop at that table combined. Monday morning I called Warren Alcott. an old friend from the Machinists' Union who'd gone back to school in his 40s and become a patent attorney specializing in manufacturing IP. We'd known each other since before either of us had gray in our beards. I laid the notebook and the folder on his desk and told him everything. The boardroom, the humiliation, paragraph 14. He read the agreement twice, slower than I had, his reading glasses pushed down his nose. "Daniel," he said finally, "do you understand what you actually have here?" "I own the patent," I said. "I always did. You own the patent, and the exclusive license they've built an entire company's revenue around is contingent on a condition they just violated in front of 40 witnesses." He tapped paragraph 14 with one finger. "The moment they removed you from your design role, this license reverted to non-exclusive by its own terms. Legally, right now, today, Bishop Aerospace Components has no more claim to manufacture your valve seal than any competitor who wanted to license it from you directly." I sat with that for a long moment. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and colder settled into my chest instead, the particular stillness I remembered from decades of machine work. The moment right before you pull the trigger on a cut, is going to be perfect. "What happens if I do nothing?" I asked. "Then they keep manufacturing under an agreement that's already technically void, and you let them believe it's still valid," Warren said. "Or you send formal notice. Invoke your rights under paragraph 14 and give them 90 days to either restore your position or lose exclusivity entirely." He paused. "I should tell you, this is public record the second we file anything. Patent ownership records, licensing terms, it's all searchable, all legitimate, nothing hidden or improper about any of it. Anybody with access to the Patent Office database could have found this years ago. Nobody ever bothered to look, because nobody ever imagined the old machinist had anything left worth checking." I thought about the boardroom, the hum of the air conditioner, the ice cube shifting in somebody's glass while nobody looked at me. "Send the notice," I said. 90 days. That evening, before Warren's letter went out, I sat with Elaine on our back porch, the one place in the house that still felt entirely mine, built with my own hands the summer Ryan turned 12. I told her everything, the patent, paragraph 14, the notice about to go out. I watched her face move through something I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not yet, something closer to recognition. Like she was finally looking at the actual shape of the man she'd married, instead of the shrunken version her family had spent 2 decades convincing her to see. "You never told me you kept the patent in your own name," she said quietly. "I didn't think it would ever matter," I said, which was true, and also a smaller truth hiding a bigger one. And some part of me, I think, wanted to keep one thing in this marriage that belonged only to me. That wasn't fair to you either. I know that now. She didn't say anything for a long time. Somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and went quiet. 90 days, she finally repeated, like she was trying the number on for size, trying to understand what kind of ending it might be counting down to. 90 days, I confirmed. "And then we'll both find out exactly what your family actually values." Warren's letter went out on a Tuesday certified mail, addressed to Preston Bishop as acting CEO and Walter Bishop as chairman of the board. I imagined the moment it landed on Preston's desk, though I wouldn't hear the actual details until days later, secondhand. The way most true things in that family eventually reached me, filtered through Elaine, through Ryan, through the particular silence that fell over every room I entered afterward. I went back to my workshop that night and picked up the old engineering notebook again, running my thumb along the edge of a page I'd sketched 23 years earlier, back when I still believed hard work and loyalty were the same thing as belonging. I didn't know it yet, but paragraph 14 was only the first domino. The second one was going to fall on Preston himself, in a way none of us, not me, not Elaine, not even Preston, could have seen coming. The letter reached Preston's desk on a Wednesday morning, and I know exactly what it said because Warren kept a copy for his files and eventually let me read it once the dust settled enough for legal caution to matter less than truth. 2 paragraphs, clean and precise the way good legal writing should be. Notice of license reversion under paragraph 14 of the 2003 agreement. 90 days to cure the breach by restoring Daniel R. Whitfield to his founding design role, or the exclusive manufacturing license for patent number 6,847,203 would revert permanently to non-exclusive status, opening the design to any competitor willing to negotiate terms directly with the patent holder. Preston called Elaine 40 minutes after opening it. I wasn't in the room, but Elaine told me later that his voice came through the phone so loud she had to hold it away from her ear. Is this real? Tell me this isn't real. Tell me your husband didn't just try to blow up the company over hurt feelings. I don't know what you're talking about, Elaine said, which was technically true, since I hadn't told her the exact date the notice would go out, only that it was coming. He owns the patent, Elaine. He's owned the patent this entire time. 31 years, and nobody thought to double-check the actual paperwork, because why would we? He's family. Preston's voice cracked on the word family in a way that told me, even secondhand, exactly how much that word had never once applied in the direction of me. Walter's reaction, when it finally reached me, arrived colder and more dangerous than his son's panic. Walter Bishop had built his fortune on knowing exactly which threats to take seriously and which to dismiss, and apparently he'd spent one entire day deciding I belonged in the second category before his own attorneys corrected him. He called an emergency board meeting for that Friday. I wasn't invited, which didn't surprise me. What surprised me was that Ryan was. My son called me that same Friday evening, his voice thin in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager confessing to a wrecked car. Dad, I sat in that meeting today and I didn't say a word. A long pause. Grandpa Walter kept saying you were trying to extort the company. Uncle Preston kept saying you'd been planning this for years, some kind of long con. And I just sat there. I didn't correct any of it. Why are you telling me this now? Because it's not true, and I let it sit in that room like it was. Another pause, longer. I've been quiet for 2 years, Dad. Every time Uncle Preston made a comment about you being outdated, or Grandpa Walter talked about you like you were some employee who got lucky once, I told myself it wasn't my fight. That staying quiet was smart, career-wise. But watching you actually leave that boardroom last week, I keep seeing it. I should have stood up. I didn't. I let that sit between us on the phone line for a moment. You're telling me this instead of doing something about it, I said. Not unkindly, just true. That's still a kind of quiet, Ryan. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither, honestly. Did I have a perfect answer for my own version of the same failure? 3 decades of biting my tongue at that same table. But I didn't say that part out loud yet. Some lessons needed to land on their own before I could afford to soften them with my own confessions. The 90-day clock had barely started, and already the company's operations had begun to buckle in ways that reached beyond the family. Bishop Aerospace Components manufactured valve seal assemblies for 2 major aerospace suppliers, both of whom had contracts contingent on exclusive, uninterrupted licensing of the underlying patent. Within a week of the notice going out, both suppliers' legal departments had requested formal confirmation of licensing status, a routine due diligence step that suddenly wasn't routine at all. Warren explained it to me over coffee one morning, keeping his language simple, the way a good lawyer does when he respects the person he's talking to enough not to drown him in jargon. Once a supplier's legal team smells uncertainty in a patent chain, they get nervous fast, Warren said. It's not that they think you're going to actually cut off the supply overnight. It's that uncertainty itself is a liability on their books. A few of them will quietly start reaching out to competitors just to have a backup plan ready, even if they never use it. That single fact, more than anything in the original notice, was what actually terrified Preston. I learned later that within 2 weeks, one of the 2 major suppliers had opened preliminary conversations with a competing precision manufacturer in Ohio, purely as contingency, purely as a hedge, but Preston experienced it as the walls of his kingdom cracking in real time, and he did not handle cracking walls with anything resembling grace. I want to pause here and tell you about the part of this story that still keeps me up some nights, the part with the smallest voice and the biggest weight. My granddaughter Maya, Ryan's 7-year-old daughter, called me on a Tuesday evening using her mother's old tablet video chat, her face too close to the camera the way kids always hold devices. Grandpa, Why doesn't Daddy bring you to the picnic table thing anymore? She meant the company's annual employee appreciation picnic, an event I'd started myself back in 2005 when the company was small enough that everyone still knew each other's kids' names. I'd missed it for the first time in 19 years, the week after the boardroom, unable to stomach the idea of standing in that parking lot, making small talk with people who'd watched me get erased from letterhead 6 years earlier without saying a word. Grandpa's just taking a little break from the company right now. Sweetheart, I said, keeping my voice light in the way you learn to do for grandchildren, folding real weight into something small enough for a 7-year-old's hands. Daddy and Uncle Preston were fighting about you on the phone. Daddy said you got hurt and nobody helped you. Her small face scrunched with the particular seriousness kids bring to questions adults spend a lifetime avoiding. Did somebody hurt you, Grandpa? Is that why you're sad? I didn't have a smooth answer for that. I sat there holding my own phone, 64 years old, unable to speak for several seconds, while my granddaughter waited patiently on the other end of a video call for an answer. I genuinely didn't know how to give a child, without either lying to her or handing her more truth 17 should have to carry. Sometimes people we love make mistakes, Maya, I finally said. Big mistakes. And sometimes it takes them a while to figure out how to fix it. That's not really about anybody hurting on purpose. It's about people forgetting to pay attention to who matters. That's dumb, she said, with the flat, devastating honesty only children can deliver without cruelty. If you forget who matters, you should just remember. It's not that hard. I laughed, actually laughed, the first real laugh I'd managed in 3 weeks, and told her she was smarter than most of the adults in this story, which she accepted with the total confidence of someone who'd never once doubted it. That call did something to me. It reset some frozen mechanism in my chest that had been locked in place since the boardroom. I stopped thinking about paragraph 14 as a weapon, and started thinking about it as a test. The same kind of test I'd unknowingly been failing for 2 decades by staying quiet, except now the results were finally going to mean something. The next development came from a direction none of us expected, and it started with an old colleague named Sarah Kessler, who'd worked as Bishop Aerospace's operations controller for 11 years before taking early retirement the previous spring. Sarah called me directly, unprompted, no lawyer, no scheme. Just an old friend from the shop floor who'd apparently been carrying something uncomfortable for months and finally found a reason to set it down. Daniel, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I don't work there anymore and I don't much care what Preston thinks of me these days. She paused. About 4 months before your boardroom thing, Preston brought in a consultant, some private equity guy named Marcus Renna, supposedly just for an efficiency audit. But I sat in on 2 of their meetings before I retired, and it didn't sound like an efficiency audit. It sounded like Renna was positioning to acquire a controlling stake in the company, and he kept asking very specific questions about your role, your contract, whether you had any ownership stake beyond salary. Preston kept telling him you were just an employee, easy to manage, nothing to worry about. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a feeling I recognized from decades of machine work, the particular stillness right before you realize a cut has gone wrong, before the sound even changes, just a subtle shift in vibration under your hands that tells you something's off before your eyes confirm it. Ren is still involved? I asked. I don't know for certain. I've been gone 8 months. But Preston used to talk about him like a partner, not a consultant. Called him my guy Marcus's in meetings. If I had to guess, and this is just a guess, Daniel, I'd guess whatever Preston's planning to do about your notice. Rena's whispering in his ear about it. I thanked Sarah, told her I appreciated her trusting me with it, and sat alone in my workshop for a long time afterward, turning that name over in my mind. Marcus Renna, a private equity consultant with very specific questions about my contract, 4 months before Preston humiliated me in a boardroom in front of 40 witnesses. I didn't yet understand what it meant, not fully, not the shape of the thing underneath it. But I understood enough to know that Preston Bishop, for all his noise and confidence, might not actually be the architect of what had happened to me. He might just be the tool somebody else was using, the same way a die gets used to stamp a shape it never chose for itself. I didn't know it yet, but the man who'd called me dead weight in front of 40 shareholders was about to discover exactly what it felt like to be somebody else's tool. I brought this information to Warren the following week, along with the original patent notebook, which I now carried with me almost everywhere, tucked into an old leather satchel I'd owned since Ryan was in elementary school. Warren listened to Sarah's account carefully, made notes, and then leaned back in his chair with the particular expression of a lawyer who's just watched a case become significantly more interesting. If Rena's been positioning for an acquisition, this changes the calculus, Warren said. Because right now, Bishop Aerospace's most valuable asset, the exclusive license to your patent, is sitting on a 90-day countdown to expiration. If Rena's planning to buy control of the company, he needs that license secured before any deal closes, or he's buying a company that's about to lose its core product line, which means Preston isn't just fighting you to save face anymore. He's fighting you because somebody above him is applying pressure he probably doesn't even fully understand yet. You think Preston knows he's being used? Warren considered the question seriously before answering the way he always did. I think men like Preston rarely know they're being used until the moment it's too late to matter. He probably believes Rena respects him, sees him as a genuine partner. Men like Rena are very good at making that belief feel true right up until it stops being useful. I thought about my son Ryan's confession on the phone, sitting silent in that emergency board meeting, while his uncle and grandfather constructed a story about me that wasn't true. I thought about myself, 31 years of staying quiet at that same table, mistaking patience for virtue when it had actually just been fear wearing patience's clothes, and now here was Preston, apparently walking the exact same road, mistaking a predator's attention for partnership. The same blindness passed down through that family like an inheritance. Nobody chose, but everybody carried anyway. What do we do with this? I asked Warren. For now, nothing rash. We verify what we can through legitimate channels, public business filings, any registered interest Rena's firm has disclosed, anything on the record. We don't act on secondhand gossip alone, even from a source as credible as your friend Sarah. But Daniel, Warren leaned forward. I want you to understand something. You came to me 3 weeks ago, holding a piece of paper that made you powerful. What you're describing now might mean you're holding something considerably larger than that. Not just leverage over Preston and Walter. Possibly the only thing standing between this entire company and getting quietly sold out from under both of them by a man neither of them fully understands they're dealing with. I sat with that for a long moment. The old notebook heavy in my satchel, 31 years of Wyatt Ott, finally starting to feel less like weakness and more like the patient, careful work of a man who'd spent his whole life learning that the right cut only needs to happen once, as long as you take the time to measure it correctly first. 2 weeks later, a public records search Warren's paralegal turned up exactly what we needed, and nothing we didn't have any right to know. Rena Capital Partners, a mid-sized private equity firm based in Charlotte, had filed a standard disclosure with the SEC 3 months earlier, indicating an intent to acquire a controlling interest in a private manufacturing entity in the aerospace components sector, the target company unnamed per standard confidentiality provisions, but the filing date and sector description lined up precisely with the timeline Sarah had described. Public record. Filed voluntarily by Rena's own firm as required by law. Nothing hacked, nothing stolen, nothing that hadn't already been sitting in plain sight for anyone who thought to look. I finally understood the full shape of what had happened to me. Preston hadn't orchestrated my removal purely out of 2 decades of quiet resentment, though that resentment was real enough on its own. He'd been maneuvered into it, coached and flattered by a man who needed me gone before he could safely close a deal that would strip control from both bishops the moment the ink dried, the same way Preston had spent years working to strip it from me. The machinist gets removed so the son can take over. The son gets removed so the outside buyer can take over. Everyone in that boardroom, it turned out, had been standing on the exact same trapdoor, and only one of them had bothered to check what was actually holding the floor together. With 60 days left on the 90-day clock, I called Warren and told him it was time to request a private meeting with Preston. Not a lawyer's letter this time, not a boardroom audience. Just the two of us, alone, so I could show him exactly what I knew and watch his face while he understood, for the first time in his adult life, what it actually felt like to be the person nobody had bothered to warn. The Ruth's Diner on Cypress Street had been Preston's regular breakfast spot since business school, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never stopped coming, chosen deliberately by me because I wanted him somewhere ordinary, somewhere without a boardroom table to hide behind. I called him myself. No lawyer's letterhead. No formal notice, just a phone call. I think we need to talk before this goes any further, I said. Just the two of us. No lawyers, no Walter. Tomorrow morning, Ruth's, 7 o'clock. He agreed faster than I expected, which told me something about the pressure already building on his end that I hadn't fully accounted for. Preston looked older when he walked in than he had 6 weeks earlier in that boardroom. The confidence that used to sit on him like a well-tailored suit had thinned into something closer to exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, a coffee order he barely touched. He sat across from me in the booth and didn't say anything for a long moment, just turned his mug slowly between his palms. "You could have destroyed us with that notice," he finally said. "You still can. 60 days left, and half our suppliers are already sniffing around backup manufacturers." "I know," I said. "I'm not here to talk about the notice, Preston. I'm here to talk about Marcus Renna." Whatever composure he'd walked in with drained visibly from his face. His hand stopped moving on the coffee mug. "How do you know that name?" "Public record," I said, and I kept my explanation short, the way Warren and I had planned. No dramatics, just facts laid out plainly on the table between two men who'd spent 2 decades circling each other without ever once speaking honestly. Renna Capital filed a disclosure with the SEC 3 months ago. Intent to acquire a controlling interest in a private aerospace components manufacturer. I'm not going to pretend I know everything about what he's told you, or what he's promised you. But I know enough to understand you're not the one steering this ship anymore, Preston. You haven't been for a while. I watched something collapse behind his eyes, slow and total. The particular expression of a man realizing the ground he's been standing on was never actually solid. That's not Marcus as a consultant, an advisor. He's helping us modernize operations, streamline Preston. I said his name quietly, not unkindly. When did he first bring up my contract? My role, specifically, not the company's operations generally. When did he first suggest it might be simpler if I weren't in the picture? Preston didn't answer right away. I watched him actually think back, actually retrace the last 8 months of his professional life through a lens he'd clearly never applied to it before. And I watched the math land on his face in real time, ugly and undeniable. 6 months ago, he said finally, very quietly, he said the company's valuation would improve significantly if design authority sat with someone with, and I'm quoting him now, someone with more scalable institutional experience. He never said your name directly, he didn't have to. And after I was gone, after that boardroom, he congratulated me. Preston's voice had gone flat, hollow. Told me I'd shown real leadership. Said the acquisition timeline could move faster now that the legacy inefficiencies were resolved. He put his head in his hands, elbows on the table, and for the first time in 11 years of knowing this man, I watched him look genuinely, completely lost. He's not buying the company to partner with us, is he? I don't know his full plan, I said honestly. But I know what usually happens to family ownership once outside capital gets control of a controlling stake. You and Walter would likely stay on paper for a while, maybe even keep titles. But the actual decisions, the actual power, that goes wherever the money sits. Same thing that happened to me, Preston. Different paperwork, same shape. He looked up at me then, and something in his face had changed. Some hard shell finally cracking under weight it had clearly been carrying alone for months. "You're telling me I did to you exactly what's about to be done to me." I didn't answer that directly. Some truths land better when you let a man arrive at them himself, instead of handing them over pre-packaged. I let the silence sit between us, the diner noise filling the gap. Someone's coffee cup clinking against a saucer 3 booths down, a radio playing low behind the counter. "There's a woman named Sarah Kessler," I finally said. "Used to work operations under you. She told me about a comment your father made at a family dinner 2 years ago. That he'd never respected men who built things with their hands, that the company only became legitimate once real business minds took over from, and I'm quoting her secondhand account of your father, the machinist and his garage project." I let that settle. "You grew up hearing that from him about me for years, Preston. I think some part of you needed to prove you weren't cut from that same cloth he dismissed. I think Rena understood exactly what kind of pressure would move you, because your own father handed him the blueprint years before he ever needed it." Preston's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might get angry, might retreat into the same defensive noise that had carried him through 11 years of undermining me one small comment at a time. Instead, something in him just seemed to give out entirely. "I have 30 days before the next board vote on the Rena deal," he said quietly. "If I bring this to Walter now, tell him what you've told me, he's going to say I'm being paranoid, that Rena's a legitimate partner, that I'm letting an old grudge with you cloud good business judgment. Then don't just tell him," I said. "Show him, the same way I showed you. Public record, nothing hidden, nothing that requires anyone to trust anyone else's word alone." We sat in that booth another 20 minutes, working through what that would actually look like, and somewhere in that conversation the balance of power between us shifted so completely that neither of us fully acknowledged it out loud. I hadn't come to that diner planning to help Preston Bishop save his own position in a company his family had spent 2 decades convincing me I no longer belonged in. But watching a man discover, in real time, exactly how it felt to be quietly discarded by people he'd trusted, I found I couldn't quite bring myself to enjoy it the way some smaller, harder part of me might have expected to 6 weeks earlier. That evening I told Elaine everything. The diner, Preston's face when the truth finally landed, the shape of what Rena had actually been building underneath both of us. We sat together on the back porch, the one I'd built with my own hands, and for a long time neither of us said anything. "I owe you an apology," she finally said. "Not just about Preston or the boardroom. About 30 years of watching my family treat you like something they'd acquired instead of someone they'd married into, and telling myself it wasn't my place to say anything. Because saying something always felt like choosing sides, and I was too afraid of what it would cost me to choose yours out loud. I wasn't exactly honest with you either," I said. The confession I'd been carrying since that night on this same porch weeks earlier finally found its way fully out of me. I kept that patent in my own name for good reasons back in 2003. Protecting myself, protecting us, in case the company ever failed. But somewhere over the years, keeping that secret stopped being about protection and started being about pride. I wanted one thing your family couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, couldn't rename on a letterhead without asking me. I should have told you the day I filed it. Instead, I let it become a secret between us for over 20 years, and that's its own kind of quiet cruelty, even if I never meant it as one. She reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand, the first time she'd initiated that kind of contact in longer than either of us wanted to admit out loud. We sat like that for a long while. Two people who'd spent 3 decades circling the truth of their own marriage, the same careful, exhausted way I'd spent 3 decades at circling the truth of that boardroom table. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now we find out if your family is capable of actually changing," I said. "Or if Preston's going to walk back into that house tomorrow and let Walter talk him back into believing Rena's still his friend." Preston didn't let that happen. 2 days later, he requested a private meeting with Walter. No lawyers, no boardroom, just father and son in Walter's home office. The same room where I imagined countless decisions about my future had been made over the years without my knowledge or input. I wasn't there. I only know what happened because Elaine drove over afterward at Preston's request, sensing correctly that her presence might keep the conversation from collapsing entirely into old family patterns of blame and denial. Walter, according to Elaine, spent the first 10 minutes refusing to believe any of it. Rena had personally guaranteed the family's continued leadership. Rena had taken him to dinner 3 times, called him a visionary, praised his decades building the family's business empire. It took Preston pulling up the actual SEC filing on his phone, the plain public language of it, before Walter's certainty finally cracked. "He called me a visionary," Walter said quietly, according to Elaine, staring at his own phone like it had betrayed him personally. "He sat in my study and told me I reminded him of his own father. He told me I showed real leadership the day we pushed Dad out of the boardroom," Preston said. "It's the same script, Dad. He's not building anything with us. He's just waiting for the right moment to take what we built and hand us both a smaller title on our way out the door." Elaine told me later that Walter didn't speak again for almost 5 minutes, sitting in the same leather chair he'd occupied for every major family decision for 30 years. An old man finally confronting the shape of his own blind spots at an age when most men have stopped believing they still have any left to find. With 45 days remaining on the original 90-day clock, Warren and I received formal word through Preston's own attorney, not Rena's team, not Walter's original counsel, but new representation Preston had retained independently, requesting a meeting to discuss restoring my role and renegotiating licensing terms, along with formally terminating the company's advisory relationship with Rena Capital Partners. I want to be honest about how that news landed in me. Some smaller, harder part of me wanted more than an apology and a renegotiated contract. Some part of me wanted the full reckoning, wanted Preston and Walter to feel exactly the scale of what they'd done to me across 2 decades of small dismissals and 1 very public humiliation. But sitting in my workshop that evening, running my thumb along the worn edge of that old engineering notebook, I found myself thinking less about revenge and more about my granddaughter's small, devastating logic from weeks earlier. If you forget who matters, you should just remember. It's not that hard. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of this entire ordeal wasn't going to be winning back what Preston had taken from me. It was going to be deciding what kind of man I wanted to be once I'd actually won. The company's 25th anniversary rebrand launch had been scheduled for months before any of this began. A large gala event at a downtown event hall, meant to unveil a new expanded product line and, not coincidentally, formally announce the completed transition to Rena Capital's partnership. Preston hadn't canceled it. Instead, with Warren's counsel and my reluctant agreement, we decided the gala would become something else entirely. The place where every remaining thread of this story would finally get pulled tight in front of the people who'd spent 2 decades watching me disappear from my own company. One small erasure at a time. 200 guests, employees, suppliers, industry press, extended family. Rena himself would be there, expecting to formally announce his acquisition to a room full of witnesses who had no idea the ground beneath that announcement had already shifted completely out from under him. Ryan called me the week before the event, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in months. "Dad, I want to be there. Not in the back, not staying quiet this time. I want to actually say something, in front of everyone, about what you built and what almost got taken from you." "You don't have to do that," I said. "This isn't your fight to carry, son." "It is, though," he said. "It's been my fight the whole time. I just spent 2 years pretending it wasn't." The gala took place on a Saturday evening in late October, the downtown event hall lit up with the company's new blue and silver rebrand banners. 200 chairs arranged around a stage where Preston was scheduled to unveil the Rena partnership at 8 o'clock sharp. I arrived at 7, wearing a suit I hadn't worn in years. The old leather satchel tucked under my arm like it had been surgically attached to me for the past 2 months. Marcus Rena arrived at 7:30, exactly on schedule, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who believed the evening belonged entirely to him. I watched him shake hands, work the room, laugh at something Walter said near the bar, and I understood in that moment exactly why this man had been so effective at dismantling a family from the inside without any of them noticing the walls coming down around them. He was good. Genuinely, dangerously good at making people feel important right up until the moment he no longer needed them to feel that way. At 7:45, Preston found me near the back of the hall, away from the crowd, his tie already slightly loosened despite the early hour. "You still willing to do this my way?" he asked. "Your way," I confirmed, "not mine." I said I'd trust your judgment on how this gets handled tonight, and I meant it. Preston's plan, worked out over the previous week with Warren's careful guidance, avoided every mistake the skill of hindsight might have warned a less careful man about. Nothing about Rena's private financial dealings would be spoken aloud to 200 witnesses, nothing internal, nothing unverified. Only what had already been legally confirmed through public filings and Rena's own signed advisory agreement, which Preston's new attorney had reviewed line by line for a termination clause triggered by material misrepresentation, a clause Rena himself had insisted on, including months earlier, apparently never imagining it might someday be turned against him. At 8 o'clock, Preston took the stage as scheduled. He thanked the room for 25 years of history, mentioned the company's founding, and then, instead of introducing Rena as planned, he did something the assembled crowd clearly hadn't expected. 25 years ago, this company existed because one man designed something nobody else in this industry could build. Preston said, his voice carrying steady across the hall, despite what I knew it must have cost him to keep it that way. 6 weeks ago, in a boardroom most of you weren't in, I called that man dead weight and had him removed from this company. I was wrong. I've spent the last month learning exactly how wrong and exactly why. A murmur moved through the crowd. Near the bar, I watched Walter's face go rigid, watched Rena's easy smile falter for the first time all evening. Preston gestured toward me, and I walked to the stage carrying the old leather satchel, my hands steadier than I expected them to be given everything I remembered about tented anniversary parties and shaking hands and a father's hardware store auctioned off piece by piece in front of a whole town. I opened the satchel and removed the engineering notebook, the same one I'd found behind paint cans in my own garage, its pages soft with 23 years of handling. "This notebook holds the original design work for the valve seal that built this company," I said, holding it up so the room could see it, resisting every instinct to explain more than the moment required. I filed the patent under my own name in 2003, legally, properly, with an attorney both families trusted at the time. I never hid that fact. I simply never had reason to mention it, because nobody in this company ever asked me a question that would have required the answer. I set the notebook down on the podium, open to a page of my own handwritten calculations from over 2 decades earlier. 6 weeks ago, I was told I was dead weight in front of 40 shareholders. Tonight, I'd like this room to understand that the patent behind everything you're here to celebrate never once stopped belonging to the man you were told didn't matter anymore. I didn't read the licensing terms aloud, didn't cite paragraph 14, didn't turn the evening into a legal recitation. Warren had been clear on that point, and I'd agreed completely. Anything requiring genuine legal nuance belonged in a courtroom or a boardroom, not shouted across 200 wine glasses. What I offered the room instead was simpler and, I think, more honest. A man standing in front of the thing he'd built, refusing any longer to be erased from the story of it. Near the bar, Rena had gone very still. Preston turned to address him directly, and this was the part neither of us had fully scripted, the part that came from whatever had actually broken open in Preston during that diner conversation weeks earlier. "Marcus," Preston said, his voice carrying an edge I'd never once heard from him in 11 years. "Your advisory agreement with this company included a termination clause for material misrepresentation regarding your firm's intentions toward existing leadership and IP holders. I think you know exactly why my attorney sent you formal notice of termination this afternoon." Rena's composure cracked, just barely, just enough. "This is a business misunderstanding," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "I'd be happy to discuss the specifics privately, Preston. This isn't the venue. You told me pushing my own father out of this boardroom showed real leadership," Preston said, and his voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "You told my father he reminded you of your own. Both of us believed you, because we wanted to believe somebody finally saw us the way we wanted to be seen. I don't know if either of us will ever fully trust our own judgment again after this, but I know exactly what you were actually building toward, and it wasn't a partnership with this family. It was the end of it. Walter crossed the room then, slower than his son, an old man's careful steps carrying more weight than his usual commanding stride. He stopped in front of me, not Rena, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. 31 years, Walter finally said, quiet enough that only those closest to us could hear it. I loaned you $40,000 in 1998 and spent every year since acting like that loan bought me the right to decide how much respect you'd earned. I was wrong about that math a long time before tonight, Daniel. I just never let myself do the arithmetic honestly. I didn't have a gracious response ready for that, not immediately. I stood there, the old notebook still open on the podium behind me, and let the silence between us hold its own weight, rather than rushing to fill it with forgiveness. I wasn't yet sure I could offer honestly. It was Ryan who broke that silence, stepping up onto the small stage riser without being asked, standing beside me in front of the entire room. I've worked at this company for 2 years, he said, his voice shaking slightly at first, and then steadying as he continued. I watched my father get pushed out of a business he built with his own hands, and I said nothing because staying quiet felt safer than choosing a side in my own family. I'm done being quiet. He turned to look directly at Preston and Walter. My father is the reason any of us have anything worth celebrating tonight. I should have said that 6 weeks ago in that boardroom, instead of tonight, in front of 200 people. I'm sorry it took me this long. Near the back of the hall, I noticed a small cluster of people I recognized, former machine shop crew, 3 retired employees who'd worked under me in the earliest years, Sarah Kessler among them, standing quietly together, not speaking, just present, the way people show up for something without needing to be asked or thanked for it. Nobody had organized their attendance. They'd simply heard, through whatever network retired manufacturing workers maintain, that tonight mattered, and they'd come. Marcus Renna left the gala 20 minutes later, his composure fully restored by the time he reached the door, already composing whatever version of this evening he'd carry into his next targeted family business. Men like that rarely learn anything permanent from a single failed attempt. But he left, and the deal left with him, and whatever quiet architecture he'd spent months building underneath. Both Bishop men collapsed in the same 20 minutes. It had probably taken him years to perfect elsewhere. The gala didn't end there, though the drama largely did. 200 guests slowly returned to conversation, to wine, to the ordinary rhythms of a corporate celebration, finding its footing again after an earthquake nobody had expected. I found myself standing near the edge of the room an hour later, watching Elaine talk quietly with her father, watching something that looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like an actual conversation between the two of them instead of a performance of one. She found me eventually near the tall windows overlooking the parking lot, the same windows where, 6 weeks earlier, I'd caught my own reflection looking like a man who no longer had any right to the shirt on his back. This time the reflection looked different, not triumphant exactly, just steadier. You didn't destroy them, she said quietly, standing beside me. You could have. Tonight, in front of everyone, you could have taken it all the way down to nothing. You didn't. I thought about it, I admitted. For about 6 weeks straight, if I'm honest with you. But somewhere in the middle of all this, your father stopped being the only person I was measuring myself against. I had to decide what kind of man I wanted to still be once this was finished, not just what kind of man I wanted them to remember losing to. She reached for my hand, and this time, in front of the window, in front of anyone who cared to notice, she pulled me into an embrace neither of us had allowed ourselves in longer than either of us wanted to admit. 36 years of careful distance finally collapsing into something simpler. The formal terms took another 2 weeks to finalize through Warren's office. Worked out not as punishment, but as the kind of structure a family actually needs if it intends to survive its own worst chapter. I want to walk you through them plainly, because I think the shape of an ending matters as much as the ending itself. First, the licensing agreement was renegotiated at fair market royalty terms. permanently removing any condition tying my compensation to holding a specific title or role. I would never again be one boardroom vote away from losing what I'd built. Second, Preston and Walter both signed a formal acknowledgement, reviewed and confirmed by independent counsel, that they had been notified in full of the change in company design, leadership, and licensing structure, with an accompanying agreement not to contest the terms going forward. Nothing about signing away rights to something that was never legally theirs to begin with, simply an honest, documented recognition of the truth. Third, an irrevocable trust was established for Maya and her two younger cousins, funded by a fixed percentage of ongoing royalty income, completely outside either Preston's or Walter's control, accessible when each grandchild turned 25. Fourth, the company would formally restore my name to its letterhead, not as chief design officer required to attend every boardroom battle for the rest of my life, a role I ultimately declined to reclaim, but as founder emeritus, a title with no obligations attached beyond the truth, it simply stated aloud. Fifth, both Preston and Walter agreed to attend a series of family counseling sessions with Elaine, Ryan, and myself, not performative, not for anyone else's benefit, just an honest attempt to learn how to actually speak to each other after 2 decades of not bothering to try. Preston's private equity deal collapsed entirely within a month, word of Rena's conduct having quietly circulated through enough industry channels that no comparable buyer stepped forward to replace him. The company survived, smaller in ambition than the rebrand had promised, but standing on ground that finally belonged, in full and honest measure, to the people who'd actually built it. I want to tell you about the second gathering, the one that mattered more to me than the gala ever could. 6 weeks after that night, Elaine organized a small dinner at our house. Nothing formal, no stage, no 200 witnesses. Just Preston, Walter, Ryan, and his wife, Maya, and her younger cousins, gathered around the same table where I'd once asked Elaine whether she'd known what her family was about to do to me and received only silence in return. Walter stood up near the end of that dinner, an old man clearing his throat in a room considerably smaller than any boardroom he'd commanded for 30 years. I spent most of my life believing respect was something you earned by controlling the terms other people lived under, he said. Daniel taught me something different, though I doubt he set out to teach me anything at all. Some of the most valuable things a family owns were never actually the ones with our name printed on the letterhead. Maya, 7 years old and entirely unimpressed by adult solemnity, tugged at my sleeve halfway through Walter's speech. Grandpa, does this mean you're coming back to the picnic table thing? I think I might, I told her, and meant it. I still keep that old engineering notebook in the same fireproof lockbox behind the paint cans in my workshop, though these days I take it out far less often, mostly just to remind myself, on quiet evenings, of the difference between the quiet that protects you and the quiet that slowly erases you, a difference it took me 31 years. And one boardroom humiliation to finally understand. My father lost his hardware store in front of a whole town in 1979, and some part of me spent the following 4 decades bracing for the same public unmaking, mistaking silence for safety the entire time. It turns out the only real safety was ever in the paper I'd quietly kept in my own name, and the family who finally, painfully, learned to see me clearly enough to keep. They called me dead weight in a boardroom full of people who wouldn't look at me. I stood there feeling like an old clock nobody wanted anymore, carried out to the curb without a second thought. But an old clock, if you take the time to actually open the casing and look inside, is very often still keeping perfect time, patiently, quietly, waiting for somebody to finally notice it never stopped. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what you'd have done in Daniel's position. To hear the next story, click the video on the left. Thank you for watching.